Run the waning pages.
The grind of fortune and fame. I'm weary of mind, I'm sick of the game. I long for the folks who call me by name. I wanna go home. I'm acting a part, I try to be gay, but down in my heart it's only play. I haven't a friend to whom I can say, I wanna go home. Noisy streets, dingy lights, the play goes on. Weary feet, restless night, another dawn. And when the sun is lacking in cheer, when all that you won was bought with a tear, let me go back where hearts are sincere. I wanna go home. Noisy streets, dingy lights, the play goes on. Weary feet, restless nights, another dawn. And when the sun is lacking in cheer, when all that you won was bought with a tear, let me go back where hearts are sincere. I wanna go home.
All right, bruvs. We're back with Donna Tartt's The Little Friend, the waning pages of the book. Picking up at page 535, I believe, which leaves 20 pages left. It'll start falling on me. Actually, we're on page 530. The hours dragged, interminable, white on white. Harriet had nothing to read, and though her head ached terribly, she was too afraid to go to sleep. Mr. Dial had left the Sunday school booklet called Apron String Devotionals with a picture of a rosy baby in an old-fashioned sun bonnet pushing a flower cart, and at last, in desperation, she turned to this. It was designed for the mothers of young children, and it disgusted Harriet in a matter of moments. As disgusted as she was, she read the whole thing from cover to flimsy cover, and then sat and sat. There was no clocks in the room, no pictures to look at, and nothing to keep her thoughts and fears from roiling miserably about, nothing except the pain which intermittently pitched through her stomach in waves. Oh man, I forgot. I gotta go to open the chat. We got people chatting. It's a storybook, bruv. It's called The Little Tartt. The Little Tartt. The Little Friend by Donna Tartt. Donna Tartt. Tartt. We'll open this chat room when I can get it to load on my page here. There we go. Then we can speak together. Where was I at? Let's see what you geniuses have to say. Oh, we got feedback. Got to turn up the volume. There's always something to be done here. How do you guys even find this channel live? Every time I go live, all I see is like 10 channels, and then it just... My name is Biff. I mean, it's Lufty and Jita. Hello, bro. Like I said, how do you guys find this? Why don't you answer? You are reading a book. All right. When it rolled away, she lay beached and gasping, washed clean for the moment, but soon her worries set in gnawing again with renewed energy. Healy hadn't actually promised anything. Who knew if he'd get the gun or not? And even if he did go get it, would he have the sense to throw it away? Healy in the band hall showing off her father's gun. Hey, Dave, look at this. She winced and pressed her head deep in the pillow. Her father's gun, her fingerprints all over it, and Healy, the biggest blabbermouth in the world. Yet, who could she have asked to help her but Healy? No one. No one. After a long while, the nurse lumbered in again, her thick-soled shoes all worn down on the outer edge, to give Harriet a shot. Harriet, who was rolling her head around and talking to herself a bit, struggled to pull away from her worries. With effort, she turned her attention to the nurse. She had a jolly, weather-beaten face with wrinkled cheeks, thick ankles, and rolling, off-centered walk. Except for her nurse's uniform, she might have been the captain of a sailing ship, striding across decks. Her name tag said Gladys Coots. Now I'm going to get this over with as quick as I can, she was saying. Harriet, too weak and too worried to put up her customary resistance, rolled on her stomach and grimaced as the needle slid into her hip. She hated shots and when younger had screamed and cried and fought to escape. To such a degree that Edie, who knew how to give injections, had on several occasions impatiently rolled up her sleeves right in the doctor's office and taken over with the needle. Yeah, it's the Bible, bruv. This is the new Bible, apparently, because everyone asked that question. Where's my grandmother? She asked as she rolled over, rubbing the stung place on her bottom. Mercy, ain't nobody told you? What? Cried Harriet, scrabbling back in the bed like a crab. What happened? Where is she? Sash. Calm down. Energetically, the nurse began to plump up the pillows. She had to go downstairs for a while, is all, she repeated when Harriet looked at her doubtfully. Now lie on back and make yourself comfortable. Never again in her life would Harriet know such a long day. Pain pulsed and spangled, merciless in her temples. A parallelogram of sun shimmered motionless on the wall. Nurse Coots, swaying in and out with the bedpan, was a rarity. A white elephant, much heralded, returning every century or so. In the course of the interminable morning, she drew blood, administered eye drops, brought Harriet iced water, ginger ale, a dish of green gelatin, which Harriet tasted and pushed aside. Whoa, there goes the bell. Cutlery and clattering, fretful on her bright plastic tray. Fearfully, she sat upright in bed and listened. The corridor was a sedate net of echoes. Talk at the doors. At the desk, occasional laughter, the tap of canes, and the scrape of walkers as gray convalescents from physical therapy drifted up and down the hall. Every so often, a woman's voice came on the intercom, calling out strings of numbers, obscure commands. Carla, step into the hallway, orderly on two. As if counting out sums, Harriet worked out what she knew on her fingers, muttering under her breath, not caring if she looked like a crazy person. The preacher didn't know about the tower. He'd said nothing to indicate he knew Danny was up there or dead, but all that might change if the doctor figured out that bad water was what had made Harriet sick. The Trans Am was parked far enough from the tower that probably no one had thought to look up there. And if they hadn't already, who knows? Maybe they wouldn't. But maybe they would. And then there was her father's gun. Why hadn't she picked it up? How could she have forgotten? Of course, she hadn't actually shot anybody, but the gun had been shot They'd know that, and the fact that it was at the base of the tower would surely be enough. Somebody go up and look in the tower. Who are you at home with or alone? And Healy, all his cheerful questions, had she been arrested, was a policeman on guard. It would be immensely entertaining for Healy if she was arrested. Not a consoling thought. A horrible idea occurred to her. What if policemen were watching the Trans Am? Wasn't the car a crime scene like on television? Wouldn't cops and photographers be standing around it, keeping guard? And sure, the car was parked a good bit away from the tower, but would Healy have the sense to avoid a crowd if he saw it? For that matter, would he be able to get near the tower at all? There were the warehouses, sure, closer to where the car was parked, and probably they'd look there first. But eventually they'd spread out toward the tower, wouldn't they? She cursed herself for not warning him to be careful. If there were a lot of people, he'd have no choice but to turn around and come home. Around mid-morning, the doctor interrupted these worries. He was Harriet's regular doctor, who saw her when she had red throat or tonsillitis, but Harriet didn't like him much. He was young, with a heavy drab face and prematurely heavy jowls. His features were stiff and his manner cold and sarcastic. His name was Dr. Breedlove, but partly because of the steep prices he charged, Edie had given him the nickname, grown popular locally, of Dr. Greedy. His unfriendliness, it was said, had kept him from a more desirable post in a better town, but he was so very curt that Harriet didn't feel she had to keep up a false front of chumminess and smiles as she did with most adults, and for this reason she respected him grudgingly in spite of everything. As Dr. Greedy circled their bed, he and Harriet avoided each other's eyes like two hostile cats. Coolly he surveyed her. He looked at her chart. Presently he demanded, "Do you eat a lot of lettuce?" "Yes," said Harriet, although she did no such thing. "Did you soak it in salt water?" "No," said Harriet, as soon as she saw that no was the answer expected of her. He muttered something about dysentery and unwashed lettuce from Mexico, and after a brooding pause, he hung her chart back on the foot of her bed with a clang and turned and left. Suddenly, the telephone rang. Harriet, heedless of the IV in her arm, grabbed for it before the first ring was done. "Hey," it was Healy. In the background, gymnasium echoes. The high school orchestra practiced in folding chairs on the basketball court. Harriet could hear a whole zoo of tuning up noises, honks and chirps, clarinet squeaks, and trumpet blats. "Wait," said Harriet, when he started talking without interruption. "No, stop a second. The payphone in the school gymnasium was in a high-traffic area. No place to have a private conversation. Just answer yes or no. Did you get it?" "Yes, sir." He was talking in a voice which didn't sound at all like James Bond, but which Harriet recognized as his James Bond voice. "I retrieved the weapon. Did you throw it where I told you?" Healy crowed. "Q," he cried. "Have I ever let you down?" In the small, sour pause that followed, Harriet became aware of noise in the background, jostles and whispers. "Healy," she said, sitting up straighter. "Who's there with you?" "Nobody," said Healy, a little too fast, but she could hear the bump in his voice as he said it, like he was knocking some kid with his elbow. Whispers, somebody giggled, a girl. Anger flashed through Harriet like a jolt of electricity. "Healy," she said, "you better not have anybody there with you." "No," she said, above Healy's protestations. "Listen to me, because, hey, was he laughing? What's your problem?" "Because," said Harriet, raising her voice as far as she dared, "your fingerprints are on the gun." Except for the band and the jostles and whispers of the kids in the background, there was no sound on the other end at all. "Healy." When finally he spoke, his voice was cracked and distant. "Get away," he said crossly to some anonymous sniggerer in the background. Slight scuffle. The receiver banged against the wall. Healy came on again after a moment or two. "Hang on, would you?" he said. Bang went the receiver again. Harriet listened, agitated whispers. No, you, said someone. More scuffling. Harriet waited, footsteps running away. Something shouted, indistinct. When Healy returned, he was out of breath. Geez, he said in an aggrieved whisper. You set me up. Harriet, breathing hard herself, was silent. Her own fingerprints were on the gun, too, though certainly there was no point in reminding him of that. Who have you told? She demanded after a cold silence. Nobody. Well, only Greg and Anton and Jessica. Jessica, thought Harriet. Jessica Dees? Come on, Harriet. Now he was being all whiny. Don't be so mean. I did what you told me to. I didn't ask you to tell Jessica Dees. Healy made an exasperated noise. It's your fault. You shouldn't have told anybody. Now you're in trouble and I can't help you. But, Healy struggled for words. That's not fair, he said at last. I didn't tell anybody it was you. Me, that what? I don't know. Whatever it was, you did. What makes you think I did anything? Yeah, right. Who went to the tower with you? Nobody. I mean, said Healy, unhappily realizing his mistake too late. Nobody. Silence. Then, said Harriet, Jessica Dees. Was he nuts? It's your gun. You can't even prove I asked you. I can so. Yeah, how? I can, he said sullenly, but without conviction. I can too, because, Harriet waited, because you can't prove a thing, said Harriet, and your fingerprints are all over it. The you know what. So you better go right now and think of something to tell Jessica and Greg and Anton, unless you want to go to jail and die in the electric chair. At this, Harriet thought she had strained even Healy's credulity, but judging from the stunned silence on the other end, apparently not. Look, Heel, she said, taking pity on him. I'm not going to tell on you. You won't? He said faintly. No, it's just you and me. Nobody knows if you didn't tell them. They don't. Look, just go tell Greg and those people you were pulling their legs, said Harriet, waving goodbye to Nurse Coots, who was sticking her head in the door to say goodbye at the end of her shift. I don't know what you told them, but say you made it up. What if somebody finds it, said Healy hopelessly. What then? When you went down to the tower, did you see anybody? No. Did you see the car? No, said Healy after a moment of puzzlement. What car? Good, thought Harriet. He must have stayed away from the road and come around the back way. What car, Harriet? What are you talking about? Nothing. Did you throw it in the deep part of the river? Yes, off the railroad bridge. That's good. Healy had taken a risk climbing up there, but he couldn't have picked a lonelier spot, and nobody saw her. No, but they can drag the river. Silence, you know, he said. My prince. Harriet didn't correct him. Look, she said, with Healy, you had to just keep saying the same thing over and over until he got the message. If Jessica and those people don't tell, nobody will ever know to look for any item. So what exactly did you tell them? I didn't tell them the exact story. True enough, thought Harriet. Healy didn't know the exact story. What then? She said. It was basically, it was sort of what was in the paper this morning. All about Ferris Ratliff getting shot. They didn't say a whole lot except that the dog catcher found him last night when he was chasing a wild dog that ran off the street and back toward the old gin. Except I left out that part about the dog catcher. I made it, you know. Harriet waited. More spy. Well, go make it some more spy, suggested Harriet. Tell him. I know. Now he was excited again. That's a great idea. I can make it like From Russia with Love. You know, with the briefcase that shoots bullets and tear gas. And the shoes. The shoes. He was talking about Agent Kleb's shoes that had switchblades in the toes. Yeah, that's great, Healy. And the brass knuckles, on the training ground. You know where she punches that big blonde guy in the stomach? Healy, I wouldn't say too much. No, not too much. Like a story, though, Healy suggested cheerfully. Right, said Harriet, like a story. Lawrence Eugene Ratliff? The stranger stopped Eugene before he got to the stairwell. He was a large, cordial-looking man with a bristly blonde mustache and hard, gray, prominent eyes. Where you going? Ah. Eugene looked at his hands. He had been going up to the child's room again to see if he could get anything else out of her, but, of course, he couldn't say that. Mind if I walk with you? No problem, said Eugene in the personable voice that so far that day had not served him well. Steps echoing loudly, they walked past the stairwell and all the way down to the end of the chilly hall to the door marked exit. I hate to bother you, said the man as he pushed open the door, especially at a time like this, but I'd like to have a word with you if you don't mind. Out they stepped from antiseptic dim to scorching heat. What can I do for you? Said Eugene, slicking back his hair with one hand. He felt exhausted and stiff. Oh, man. Oh. From spending the night sitting up in a chair, and though he'd spent too much time at the hospital lately, the roasting afternoon sun was the last place he wanted to be. The stranger sat down on a concrete bench and motioned for Eugene to do the same. I'm looking for your brother Danny. Eugene sat down beside him and said nothing. He'd had enough commerce with the police to know that the wisest policy always was to play it close to the vest. The cop clapped his hands. Gosh, it's hot out here, ain't it? He said. He rummaged in his pocket for a pack of cigarettes and took his time lighting one. Your brother Danny is friendly with an individual named Alphonse D. Bienville, he said, blowing the smoke out the side of his mouth. Know him? Know of him. Alphonse was Catfish's given name. He seems like a real busy fellow. Then, confidentially, he's got a finger in every kind of damn thing going around here, doesn't he? Don't he? I couldn't say. Eugene had as little to do with Catfish as possible. Catfish's loose, easy, irreverent manner made him extremely uncomfortable. Eugene was tongue-tied and awkward around him, always at a loss for a reply. And he sensed that Catfish made fun of him behind his back. How does he fit into that little business you're all running out there? Eugene, stiffening inside, sat with his hands dangling between his knees and tried to keep his face composed. The cop stifled a yawn and then stretched his arm out along the back of the bench. He had a habit of nervously patting his stomach like a man who just lost some weight and wants to make sure that his stomach is still flat. Listen, we know all about it, Eugene, he said, when you all got going on out there. We got a half dozen men out at your grandmother's place, so come on, be straight with me and save us both a little time. I'm on, be honest with you, said Eugene, turning to look directly into his face. I've got nothing to do with any of that out there in the shed. You know about the lab, then? Tell me where the drugs are. Sir, you know more about it than I do, and that's the truth. Well, here's a little something else you might like to know. We've got an officer injured out there from one of those punji sticks y'all have rigged up around the place. Lucky for us, he fell down hollering before somebody stepped on one of those tripwires and blowed the place up. Farsh has some mental problems, said Eugene, after a small, stunned silence. The sun was shining right into his eyes, and he felt very uncomfortable. He's been in the hospital, yes, and he's a convicted felon, too. He was looking at Eugene steadily. Listen, said Eugene, crossing his legs spasmodically. I know what you're thinking. I've had some problems. I admit it. But that's all in the past. I've asked forgiveness from God and rendered my debt unto the state. Now my life belongs to Jesus Christ. Uh-huh. The cop was quiet for a moment. So tell me, how does your brother Danny fit into all this? Him and Forrest drove off together yesterday morning. That's all I know, and nothing more. Your grandmother says they quarreled. I wouldn't say quarreled exactly, Eugene said after a thoughtful pause. There was no reason for him to make things worse for Danny than they already were. If Danny hadn't shot Farish, well, then he'd have an explanation. If he had, as Eugene feared, well, then there was nothing that Eugene could say or do to help him. Your grandmother says it nearly come to blows. Danny done something to Farish to get him mad. I never saw it. Typical of Gum to say something like that. Farish never let Gum go anywhere near the police. She was so partisan in her relationships with her grandsons that she was liable to start complaining about Danny or Eugene and tattling on them about one thing and another, even as she was extolling Farish to the skies. All right, then, the cop stubbed out his cigarette. I just want to make something clear, all right? This is an interview, Eugene, not an interrogation. There's no point in me taking you down to the station and reading you your rights unless I have to. Are we agreed on that? Yes, sir, said Eugene, meeting his eye, looking quickly away. I appreciate it, sir. So, just between the two of us, where do you think Danny is? I don't know. Now, from what I hear, y'all were real close, said the cop in the same confidential tone. I can't believe he'd take off somewhere without telling you. Any friends I should know about? Connections out of state? He can't have got too far on his own on foot, not without some kind of help. What makes you think he took off? How do you know he ain't laying dead or hurt somewhere like Farish? The cop clasped his knees. Now it's interesting you asked that because we took Alphonse de Bienville into custody just this morning to ask him the very same thing. Eugene sat pondering this new wrinkle. You think Catfish done it? Done what? Said the cop casually. Shot my brother. Well, for a moment, the cop sat staring into space. Catfish is an enterprising businessman. Certainly saw a chance to make a quick buck moving in on y'all's concern, and that's what it looks like he planned to do. But here's the problem, Eugene. We can't find Danny, and we can't find the drugs, and we got no evidence that Catfish knows where they are either. So we're back to square one. That's why I was hoping you could maybe help me out a little. I'm sorry, sir, Eugene sat rubbing his mouth. I just don't know what I can do for you. Well, maybe you better think about it some more since we're talking murder and all. Murder? Eugene sat stunned. Farsh is dead? For a moment, he couldn't catch his breath in the heat. He hadn't been up to intensive care in over an hour. He had allowed Gum and Curtis to go back up by themselves from the cafeteria after their vegetable soup and banana pudding while he sat and drank a cup of coffee. The cop looked surprised, but whether it was real surprise or fake surprise, Eugene couldn't tell. You didn't know, he said. I seen you coming down the hall that way, and I just thought, listen, said Eugene, who had already stood up and was moving away. Listen, I need to get in there and be with my grandmother. Go on, said the cop, still looking away, flinging out a hand. Get back in there and do what you need to. Eugene went in at the side door and stood dazed for a moment. A passing nurse caught his eye, gave him a grave look, and a little shake of her head, and all of a sudden he began to run, shoes slapping noisily past wide-eyed nurses and all the way down to intensive care. He heard Gum before he saw her, a dry, small, lonely-sounding wail that made his heart swell with a sharp pain. Curtis, frightened-looking, gasping for breath, sat in a chair in the hall, clutching a large stuffed animal he hadn't had before. A lady from patient services, she'd been kind when they arrived at the hospital, ushered them directly back to intensive care with no nonsense, was holding his hand and talking to him quietly. She stood when she saw Eugene. Here he is, she said to Curtis. He's back, sweetie. Don't worry. Then she glanced at the door of the next room. To Eugene, she said, your grandmother. Eugene, arms outstretched, went to her. She pushed by him and staggered into the hallway, crying out Farish's name in a strange, thin, high-pitched voice. The lady from patient services caught the sleeve of Dr. Breedlove as he was passing. Doctor, she said, nodding at Curtis, who was choking for breath and practically blue in the face. He's having some breathing difficulty. The doctor stopped for half a second and looked at Curtis. Then he snapped, epinephrine. A nurse hastened away. To another nurse he snapped, why hasn't Mrs. Ratliff been sedated yet? And somehow, in the middle of all the confusion, orderlies, a shot in the arm for Curtis. Here, honey, this'll make you feel better right away. And a pair of nurses converging on his grandmother. There was the cop again. Listen, he was saying, palms in the air. You just do what you have to. What? Said Eugene, looking around. I'll be waiting for you out here, he nodded, because I think it'll speed things up if you come on down to the station with me whenever you're ready. Eugene looked around. Things hadn't sunk in yet. It was like he was seeing everything through a cloud. His grandmother had grown quiet and was being shuffled away down the cold gray hall between a pair of nurses. Curtis was rubbing his arm, but Miraculously, his wheezing and choking had quieted. He showed Eugene the stuffed animal, a rabbit, it looked like. Mine, he said, rubbing his swollen eyes with his fist. The cop was still looking at Eugene as if expecting him to say something. My little brother, he said, wiping a hand over his face. He's retarded. I can't just leave him here by himself. Well, bring him along, said the cop. I'll bet we can find a candy bar for him. Honey, said Eugene, and was knocked backwards by Curtis rushing towards him. He threw his arms around Eugene and mashed his damp face in Eugene's shirt. Love, he said in a muffled voice. Well, Curtis, said Eugene, patting him awkwardly on the back. Well, there, stop it now. I love you too. They're sweet things, ain't they? Said the cop indulgently. My sister had one of those Down syndromes. Didn't live past his 15th birthday, but my lord, we all loved him. That's the saddest funeral I've ever been to. Eugene made an indistinct noise. Curtis suffered from numerous illnesses, some of them serious, and this was the last thing he wanted to think about right now. He realized that what he actually needed to do was to ask somebody if he could see Farish's body, spend a few minutes alone with it, say a little prayer. Farish had never seemed too concerned with his destiny after death, or his destiny on earth, for that matter, but that didn't mean he hadn't received grace at the last. After all, God had smiled unexpectedly on Farish before. When he'd shot himself in the head after the bulldozer incident, and the doctors all said the machines were the only thing keeping him alive, he'd surprised them all by rising up like Lazarus. How many men had woken almost literally from the dead, sitting up suddenly amidst the life support machines asking for mashed potatoes? Would God pluck a soul so dramatically from the grave just to cast it down to damnation? If he could see the body, look upon it with his own eyes, he felt he would know the state in which Farish had passed away. I want to see my brother before they take him away, he said. I'm going to find the doctor. The cop nodded. Eugene turned to walk away, but Curtis, in a sudden panic, clutched his wrist. You can leave him out here with me if you want, said the cop. I'll look after him. No, said Eugene. No, that's fine. He can come too. The cop looked at Curtis. He shook his head. When something like this happens, it's a blessing for them, he said. Not understanding, I mean. Don't none of us understand it, said Eugene. The medicine they gave Harriet made her sleepy. Presently, there was a knock outside her door. Tatty, darling, she cried, swooping in. How's my child? Harriet, elated, struggled up in bed and held out her arms. Then suddenly it seemed to her that she was dreaming, and that. The room was empty. The strangeness so overwhelmed her that she rubbed her eyes and tried to hide her confusion. But it was Tatty. She kissed Harriet on the cheek. But she looks well, Edith, she was crying. She looks alert. Well, she's much improved, said Edie crisply. She set a book on Harriet's bed table. Here, I thought you might like to keep this, like this, to keep you company. Harriet lay back on the pillow and listened to the two of them talking, their familiar voices mingling in a radiant and harmonious nonsense. Then she was somewhere else in a dark blue gallery with shrouded furniture. Rain fell and fell. Tatty, she said, sitting up in the bright room. It was later in the day. The sunlight on the opposite wall had stretched and shifted and slunk down the wall until it spilled in a glazed pool upon the floor. They were gone. She felt dazed, as if she'd walked from a dark movie matinee out into the startling afternoon. A fat, familiar-looking blue book sat on her bed table, Captain Scott. At the sight of it, her heart lifted. Just to make sure she wasn't seeing things, she reached out and put her hand on it, and then, despite her headache and her grogginess, she laboriously sat up in bed and tried to read for a while. But as she read, the silence of the hospital room sank gradually into a glacial and otherworldly stillness, and soon she got the unpleasant sense that the book was speaking to her, Harriet, in a direct and most disturbing way. Every few lines, a phrase would stand out quite sharply and with pointed lines of and with pointed meaning, as if Captain Scott were addressing her directly, as if he had deliberately encoded a series of personal messages to her in his journals from the pole. Every few lines, some new significance struck her. She tried to argue herself out of it, but it was no use, and soon she grew so afraid that she was forced to put the book aside. Dr. Breedlove walked past her open door and stopped short to see her sitting upright in bed, looking fearful and agitated. "Why are you awake?" he demanded. He came in and examined the chart, his jolly face expressionless, and clomped off. Within 5 minutes, a nurse hurried into the room with yet another hypodermic needle. "Well, go on, roll over," she said crossly. She seemed angry at Harriet for some reason. After she left, Harriet kept her face pressed into the pillow. The blankets were soft, noises stretched out and ran smoothly over her head. Then down she spun quickly into wide, heartsick emptiness, the old weightlessness of first nightmares. "But I didn't want tea," said a fretful, familiar voice. The room was now dark. There were two people in it. A weak light burned in a corona behind their heads. Then, to her dismay, Harriet heard a voice she hadn't heard in a long time. Her father's. "Tea's all they had," he spoke with an exaggerated politeness that verged on sarcasm, "except coffee and juice. I told you not to go all the way down to the cafeteria. There's a Coke machine in the hall. Don't drink it if you don't want it." Harriet lay very still, with her eyes half closed. Whenever both of her parents were in the room, the atmosphere grew chilled and uncomfortable, no matter how civil they were to each other. "Why are they here?" she thought drowsily. "I wish it was Taddy and Edie." Then, with a shock, she realized that she'd heard her father say Danny Ratliff's name. "Isn't that too bad?" he was saying. They were all talking about it down in the cafeteria. "What? Danny Ratliff, Robin's little friend, don't you remember? He used to come up in the yard and play sometimes." Friend, thought Harriet. Fully awake now, her heart pounding so wildly that it was an effort not to tremble. She lay with her eyes closed and listened. She heard her father take a sip of coffee. Then he continued, "Came by the house afterwards. Raggedy little boy, don't you remember him? Knocked on the door and said he was sorry he wasn't at the funeral. He didn't have a ride." But that's not true, thought Harriet, panicked now. They hated each other, Ida told me so. "Oh, yes," her mother's voice lively now with a kind of pain. "Poor little thing, I do remember him. Oh, that's too bad. It's strange," Harriet's father sighed heavily. "Seems like yesterday he and Robin were playing around the yard." Harriet lay rigid with horror. "I was so sorry," said Harriet's mother. "I was so sorry when I heard he'd started getting into trouble a while ago." "It was bound to happen with a family like that. Well, they're not all bad. I saw Roy Dial in the hall, and he told me that one of the other brothers had dropped in to see about Harriet." "Oh, really?" Her father took another long sip of coffee. "Do you think he knew who she was?" "I wouldn't be at all surprised. That's probably why he stopped in." Their talk turned to other things as Harriet, seized by fear, lay with her face pressed in the pillow, very still. Never had it occurred to her that she might be wrong in her suspicions about Danny Ratliff. Simply wrong. What if he hadn't killed Robin at all? She had not bargained for the black horror that fell over her at this thought, as if of a trap clicking shut behind her, and immediately she tried to push the thought from her mind. Danny Ratliff was guilty. She knew it for a fact. It was the only explanation that made any sense. She knew what he'd done, even if nobody else did. But all the same, doubt had come down on her suddenly, and with great force, and with it the fear that she'd stumbled blindly into something terrible. She tried to calm herself down. Danny Ratliff had killed Robin. She knew it was true, it had to be, and yet, when she tried to remind herself exactly how she knew it was true, the reasons were no longer so clear in her mind as they had been, and now, when she tried to recall them, she couldn't. She bent the inside of her cheek. What had she been so sure? Why had she been so sure it was him? At one time, she was very sure the idea had felt right, and that was the important thing. But, like the foul taste in her mouth, a queasy fear now lingered close and would not leave her. Why had she been so sure? Yes, Ida had told her a lot of things, but all of a sudden, those accounts, the quarrels, the stolen bicycle no longer seemed quite so convincing. Didn't Ida hate Healy for absolutely no reason? And when Healy came over to play, didn't Ida often get outraged on Harriet's behalf without bothering to find out whose fault the quarrel was? Maybe she was right. Maybe he had done it. But now, how would she ever know for sure? With a sickening feeling, she remembered the hand clawing up from the green water. Why didn't I ask? She thought. He was right there. But no, she was too frightened, and all she wanted was to get away. Oh, look, said Harriet's mother, suddenly standing up. She's awake. Harriet froze. She'd been so caught up in her thoughts, she'd forgotten to keep her eyes shut. Look who's here, Harriet. Her father rose, advanced to the bed. Even in the shadowy room, Harriet could tell then he had put on a bit of weight since she had last seen him. Haven't seen old Daddy in a while, have you? He said when he was in a jocular mood. He liked to refer to himself as Old Daddy. How's my girl? Harriet suffered herself to be kissed on the forehead and cuffed on the cheek briskly with a cupped hand. This was her father's customary endearment, but Harriet disliked it intensely, especially from the hand that sometimes slapped her in anger. How you doing? He was saying. He'd been smoking cigars. She could smell it on him. You fooled those doctors, but good, girl, he said. He said it as if she'd pulled off some great academic or sports triumph. Harriet's mother was hovering anxiously. She may not feel like talking, Dix. Her father said without turning around, well, she doesn't have to talk if she doesn't feel like it. Looking up into her father's stout red face, his quick, observant eyes, Harriet had an intense urge to ask him about Danny Ratliff, but she was afraid. What? Her father said. I didn't say anything. Harriet's voice surprised her. It was so scratchy and feeble. No, but you were about to. Her father regarded her cordially. What is it? Leave her alone, Dick, said her mother in a low murmur. Her father turned his head quickly without saying a word, in a manner that Harriet knew very well. But she's tired. I know she's tired. I'm tired, said Harriet's father in the cold and excessively polite voice. I drove 8 hours in the car to get here. Now I'm not supposed to speak to her? Whoa, that's tough words. Well, I'm not going to finish the last 10 pages here, so we gonna leave them. We gonna leave them, dog. 5:45 to 5:55 coming up. Man, this book's gonna peter out that way. Peter out that way, son. Yeah.